Hello, students. Welcome to this lecture on women in medieval India. The medieval period, extending roughly from the 8th to the 18th century, marked a long phase of patriarchal consolidation in Indian history. This era saw repeated invasions, political fragmentation, and the rise of regional kingdoms, all of which reshaped women's lives. Earlier traces of autonomy almost disappeared as religion and society began emphasizing control over women's bodies, labor, and sexuality. The introduction of new faith like Islam and the strengthening of caste based Hindu society produced mixed outcomes, some reforms, but largely greater seclusion. The practices of parda, child marriage, female infanticide, and sati became more widespread. Women were confined to domestic spaces, their education restricted to moral or religious teachings. Yet, within this restricted framework, women contributed as poets, saints, rulers, and reformers. Voices like Mirabai, Razia Sultan, and Akka Mahadevi challenged the system. The lecture explores both decline and resistance, showing that even under deep patriarchy, Indian women found ways to express agency. Students will learn that the medieval period was not only an age of oppression, but also of silent endurance and sporadic defiance, laying the foundation for her later reforms. After the fall of ancient empires, India entered a fragmented political era. Between the 8th and 12th centuries, regional kingdoms like the Cholas, Rajputs, and Palas rose, followed by Muslim dynasties, the Delhi Sultanate, and later the Mughals. These shifts brought cultural diversity but also social rigidity. Land ownership concentrated in elite male hands, creating a feudal structure that emphasized family honor and lineage purity. The result was a stricter control over women's marriage, mobility, and sexuality. Islamic influence introduced parda and harem traditions among upper classes, while Brahmanical law further reinforced seclusion through religious justification. The blending of these systems deepened gender segregation. Women's lives depended largely on class. Royal and noble women experienced isolation in palaces, while lower class women labored in fields and markets but remained socially invisible. This background explains how patriarchy became an organizing principle of medieval India or medieval Indian life, shaping every institution from family to faith. Medieval society was strictly hierarchical, divided by caste, religion, and gender. The many reasons, or the chief reason I could say for all this deterioration, is the loss of pristine Vedic religion and its replacement by Brahmanical religion. The family became the main site of women's subordination. Marriage and motherhood defined female identity, and chastity was treated as female or as family honor. Women's movement outside the home required male permissions. The joint family system, controlled by the eldest man, restricted autonomy even within the household. Widowhood was considered a curse, and remarriage was forbidden in upper caste. Social mobility was nearly impossible. Even festivals and religious practices segregated men and women. The idea of female virtue became synonymous with silence, obedience, and sacrifice. Yet, among artisans and peasants, women contributed economically, working alongside men in agriculture and crafts, although their labor was undervalued. The system thus combined dependence with necessity. Women were indispensable yet denied recognition. This structure reveals patriarchy as both moral ideology and social control mechanisms. Formal education was almost completely denied to women in this period. Schools and madrasas were reserved for men, and literacy among women declined sharply. Hindu texts like the Smritis emphasized moral training rather than intellectual learning for girls. Islamic education for women, though permitted in principle, was limited to Quran and domestic virtues. Elite women learned music, embroidery, or poetry privately, but mass illiteracy prevailed. However, religious reform movements like the Bhakti and Sufi traditions opened informal spaces for learning. Women like Akka Mahadevi, Mirabai, and Lala Ded gained spiritual authority through devotion and self expression rather than institutional education. Their songs and verses reveal intellectual depth and courage. Education thus shifted from formal learning to emotional and spiritual expression. This transformation kept women's voices alive even in an age that silenced them publicly. Let us see the influence of religion. Religion played a central role in shaping medieval patriarchy. Brahmanical orthodoxy reinterpreted purity rules, linking sin with women's bodies and independence. Islamic law introduced parda and gender segregation, arguing for protection but resulting in control. And despite differences, both systems agreed on women's subordination to male guardians. However, religious reform movements resisted this narrative. The Bhakti saints, Andal Mirabai, Bahinabai, and others preached equality before God and rejected caste and gender discrimination. Sufi mystics like Rabia and Nizamuddin's disciples promoted compassion and brotherhood, indirectly challenging patriarchy. Still, institutional religion remained male centered, using faith to regulate women's behavior. Thus, religion in this period became, or rather, function in dual ways. It deepened control but also provided rare channels for spiritual protest. Marriage in medieval India became a contract of social control. Amongst Hindus, child marriage became common to protect caste purity, dowry increased, and polygamy amongst the elite spread. Amongst Muslims, polygamy and early marriages were accepted. Women were considered dependents throughout life under father, husband, and son. Love and partnership gave way to honor and obedience. Family honor rested on family chastity, making women's lives a matter of surveillance. Widow remarriage was almost extinct amongst upper caste, and widows were subjected to isolation or, in some areas, even sati. Yet, among lower caste and tribal groups, remarriage remained normal, showing how patriarchy was stronger amongst the educated elite. Marriage thus became the key institution through which patriarchy controlled women's mobility, sexuality, and status. The ritual of sati, where a widow immolated herself on her husband's pyre, became widespread but was confined to certain areas. It was not a common feature of North India, though it was glorified mainly by the colonial rulers as being a inhuman practice of the Hindu society, but in fact, it was the evidences are not available as to its widespread existence or growth. Many times reasons are assigned to the different law schools which are more liberal towards women, like Daya Bhaga, which is a Hindu school of law dealing with property, inheritance, and a number of local rituals, was more popular in West Bengal, the present West Bengal, and the areas around. And that gave equal property rights to women. And perhaps that was the reason that led to such kinds of incidents rather than religion. If we go by the ancient text or religious texts like Vedas, there's no leave aside sanction, there's no reference to such kind of practice. We have epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, where we do not find any incidents of sati. King Dashrath died leaving his three wives, but none of them committed sati. Even in the Mahabharata, which is a story of battles where thousands of people lost their lives, we do not find any incidents of sati except for one, wherein one of the wives of King Pandu, Madri, out of regret and repentation, became sati. However, it was popularized as something common, as something glorified by the upper caste, but there are no such evidences. But definitely, such kinds of incidents reveal how patriarchy used religion and culture to control women, even their life. The ideal of self sacrifice masked social cruelty, parda and seclusion. Of course, with the arrival of Mughals and the deterioration of the Vedic religion, with Vedic religion losing its hold on the society, parda became spread across northern India, especially after Islamic rule. Initially meant for royal women's security, it soon symbolized female virtue. Hindu elites imitated it to maintain status. Women lived behind veils and latticed windows, restricted mobility and interaction. Education and social engagements declined further. In some regions, harem life produced refinement. Literature, embroidery, and art flourished privately, but that was in no better situation than the Vedic period when women enjoyed full autonomy to move, to get educated, to learn art, etc., etc. Isolation outweighed privileges in this period. Parda excluded women totally from public life, economic and political life, and thus deepening dependence and increasing ignorance amongst women. However, peasant and tribal women remained unveiled, continuing the outdoor work. This shows how patriarchy varied by class. The veil, both cloth and concept, became a visible mark of control, turning protection into separation from the public world. Well, economically, women's contribution remained essential but undervalued. Rural women tilled fields, drew water, spun yarn, and managed households. Urban women worked as midwives, weavers, and servants. Courtesans and entertainers had independent incomes but faced moral stigma. In guilds and markets, a few widows and traders managed small businesses. Royal women sometimes patronized art and charity but lacked legal control over wealth. Inheritance laws favored sons, daughters received dowry, not property. The concept of Istridhan, very well inscripted or established in our ancient religious scriptures, right from Vedas to Manusmriti to Arthashastra, was totally eroded, taken away. Economic autonomy shrank steadily as both patriarchy and feudalism expanded. Yet, survival of artisan and peasant women's labor kept families alive, proving their invisible centrality. Students should note that patriarchy thrives not by excluding women from work, but by denying them recognition and ownership. Let us start with the impact of Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement that ran from 12th to 17th century became a spiritual rebellion against caste, and patriarchy. Women saints used devotion to claim moral equality with men. Andal in Tamil Nadu, Akka Mahadevi in Karnataka, Mirabai in Rajasthan, and Behnabai in Maharashtra expressed divine love as freedom from worldly control. Their poems rejected rituals and questioned social hypocrisy, and their freedom to choose was central to all this struggle. They refused to conform to marriage or purity norms, asserting individuality through spirituality. For many uneducated women, bhakti became emotional education, a path to self realization. Though male reformers often idealize them as devotees, their songs reveal awareness of gender injustice. The movement gave women moral authority when society denied them intellectual power, leaving a legacy of equality in devotion that still inspires reform. And claiming freedom of choice was central to the songs and the writings of these these women like Mirabai and Akka Mahadevi, etc. Well, if we talk about Sufi traditions, Sufi mysticism offered another space for female participation. Women attended khanqahs, that is, spiritual centers, and took part in communal prayers. Sufi saints respected women as seekers of truth rather than dependence. Figures like Rabia al Basri, though outside India, influenced Indian Sufi tradition or Sufi thought deeply. Indian Sufi orders valued compassion, humility, and love over ritual, enabling women to gain dignity through service and faith. Some Mughal princes, such as Jahara Begum, became Sufi patrons and writers, blending politics with spirituality. However, Sufism too remained largely male led, with limited space for women's institutional leadership. Still, compared to Orthodox religion, it acknowledges women's inner strength and independence, offering spiritual equality within an unequal world. Let us see women in politics and administration. Despite seclusion, some women rose to power through capability and circumstances. Razia Sultan in 13th century became Delhi's first and only female ruler, defying gender barriers. Queens like Durgavati of Gondwana, Chand Bibi of Ahmednagar, Noor Jahan under the Mughals exercised administrative and military authority. Their reigns proved that leadership was possible uh, within a patriarchal order. However, such examples remain rare and often met with resistance from male elites. Royal women also influenced policy through diplomacy, charity, and education patronage. Their visibility in politics did not reflect social freedom but showed exceptional agency. The achievements of these rulers remind students that women's strength persisted even in restrictive environments. Medieval art and literature reflected both devotion and control. Women appeared as heroines, goddesses, or symbols of virtue in poetry and paintings. Mughal miniature art depicted refined women in courtly elegance, but rarely as thinkers. Folk songs, however, preserve women's emotions, love, pain, and protest, often anonymously. Bhakti poetry and Sufi lyrics became vehicles of a female voice. Elite women wrote in Persian and Sanskrit. Gulbadan Begum's memoirs describe harem life with sensitivity. Cultural participation thus continued privately, not publicly. Art celebrated femininity but silenced autonomy. Still, literature of devotion, beauty, and longing kept alive women's experience in an age of political exclusion, forming India's emotional heritage. Well, regional variations. Conditions for women differed across regions. In southern India, under Cholas and later Vijayanagar rulers, women participated in trade, temple service, and local councils. In Rajasthan and northern states, Rajput honor codes imposed stricter seclusion. Bengal saw child marriage and widow austerity. Kerala retained matrilineal inheritance in some communities. Muslim women in Deccan courts uh, enjoyed moral cultural exposure, but definitely under severe restrictions. And of course, uh, uh, their experience and their cultural exposure was better than the Muslim women in northern India. Tribal and peasant women continued traditional equality through labor. Now, these variations show that patriarchy was not uniform. It adapted to local economies and customs. So, it was more severe in northern India. Parda, child marriage, and seclusion were much deeper in North India, both amongst Hindu and Muslim women, as compared to southern India. Understanding regional diversity helps students avoid generalizations and recognize how geography, religion, and class shaped gender realities. Well, let us see the relationship between women and law. Legal systems reflected social biases. Hindu laws based on Dharma Shastras later on, under Brahmanical influence, denied women independent rights. As long as Vedic uh, hold over the society was strong, women enjoyed all sorts of independence and autonomy. Muslim law offered limited property and through meher and inheritance, but and emphasized male guardianship. Court cases involving women were decided by male judges. Punishments for adultery or disobedience were harsh, while male offences went lightly treated. Legal education excluded women completely, yet some Mughal rulers, notably Akbar and Jahangir, issued edicts protecting women from forced marriage or sati. But as you can see, law remains contradictory, progressive in intent but patriarchal in execution. It reveals how state and society interact to maintain gender inequality while claiming moral authority. Resistance and reform, even with oppression, women resisted in subtle and open ways. Bhakti and Sufi women defied family control through devotion. Poets used songs as protest. Queens governed to prove capability. Common women showed resilience by managing farms, families, and communities. During wars, reformers like Kabir, Nanak, and Akbar criticized gender injustices, promoting education and freedom in principle. These movements planted seeds of later reform. Their significance lies not in immediate success but in preserving moral defiance. Resistance during the medieval era proved that patriarchy, though strong, was never absolute. Women's endurance and creativity kept the idea of equality alive for the modern awakening. The medieval period from 8th to 18th century represents the deepest entrenchment of patriarchy in Indian history. Social custom, law, religion, and economy worked together to restrict women's freedom. Yet, this age also produced saints, poets, and rulers who challenged inequality through courage and creativity. Understanding this complexity prevents simplistic judgments of decline alone. It shows that oppression and resistance coexisted, shaping India's gender history. The endurance of women through centuries of limitation is itself a form of power. By studying this era, students learn that freedom is not a sudden gift. It grows from centuries of quiet defiance, faith, and persistence. Similarly, the decline of rights is also not sudden and abrupt, rather, a gradual decline or deterioration from pristine Vedic religion to Brahmanical religion, making women completely under the control of the patriarchal system. The story of medieval Indian women is not one of silence, but of survival and spiritual strength that prepared the ground for modern reform. Though the number of women who came out to speak the truth or assert were limited, but nevertheless they became great examples. Thank you.